Hi, my name's William Squire. I'm head of sales at Consalia, and today I am the host of the Sales Transformation Podcast. Usually it's Phil, but on this special occasion it's me, and I'm joined here today with our very own Luke. Luke, you have been on this podcast before, so welcome back. And yeah, maybe I can ask you to introduce what this podcast is all about.
Yeah, thanks, Will. It's good to be back on the podcast. Um, this podcast is for Mental Health Awareness Week 2023, which takes place from Monday the 15th of May. And, Mental Health Awareness Week is there to promote positive practices in mental health. It's, primarily there to provide information to people that might support them with their mental health. And of course, where we're positioned as Consalia, we're doing this to talk about mental health from a sales perspective, and hopefully provide our listeners with some interesting information.
Yeah, and Luke, just to set a bit more context, I mean, we ran a really successful campaign last year. So perhaps you could, I mean, it was you that led it. Why don't you let people know what we did last year and why it's important to us, and yeah, what we're doing this year?
So, so last year we used a model called the 5 Ways to Wellbeing. It was a really simple framework for people to achieve a positive mental well-being. So it looks at 5 areas. One is connect, so how are we interacting with other people, how that might help our mindset. It recognizes that giving to people, whether that's your time or your effort or even your companionship, can help your mental well-being, but the mental well-being of others. One area is take notice, so it's sort of recognizing the importance of coming into the present. A lot of people just don't do that. We go through life 100 miles an hour, wake up, we go to work, we go home, and we never really sit there and enjoy the moment. One area of 5 Ways to Wellbeing is learn, which is, of course, very important to us, being in the education sector. And finally, be active. So it sort of promotes the positive impact of physical practice. Um, our project was a sales spin on the 5 Ways to Wellbeing. So our project was called Five Salespeople Discuss 5 Ways to Wellbeing.
Yeah,
So we invited 5 of our students. Some were alumni, some were students at the time. They've now graduated, and we had people from all levels of seniority. So we had someone who was a chief sales officer, and we had someone who was in their first few years in sales as an account manager. And we asked them to reflect on, from the lens of a salesperson, how do you exhibit these 5 areas, these 5 ways to well-being? The project was, ultimately it's the same goal as what we're trying to do this year. We're trying to get salespeople talking about mental health. And that's really important to me. I've got bipolar, so I've always been quite keen on spreading the word about positive mental practices. And now I'm a salesperson myself. I think it's really important that we're looking out for our community and encouraging them to think about positive ways they can improve their mental well-being.
yeah. And I think it's, you know, evidence from last year. It doesn't matter if you're junior, if you're senior, doesn't matter your role. Everyone processes things differently, and everyone feels pressure in different ways. And mental well-being is just something that needs to be brought front of mind every now and again. And that's why I think Mental Health Awareness Week is such a good initiative. I wish, throughout the rest of the year, we could be more conscious. I think sometimes we quite often forget, don't we, how important it is to recognize mental health. I know that you and I quite often discuss it, and we bring up the 5 ways occasionally,
Yeah.
um, to see, well, are we still living that? Are we still, living by the 5 ways? And quite often, you recognize actually you might be dropping something. I don't know what you think about that.
No, I agree that, sometimes these weeks, whether they're Mental Health Awareness Week or any other important cause out there, they are a great reminder. But I totally agree that things fall by the wayside. You know, if Mental Health Awareness Week is in May, how are you really doing in November? Six
Yeah,
months after Mental Health Awareness Week, 6 months before the next one. And like you say, I like that we talk about the 5 ways in our reflections, whether that's on a weekly basis or whenever we get the chance to. And that's why I really like it as a framework, because it's simple.
yeah.
And we can't overcomplicate our approaches to mental health. We need to keep it simple, because by doing that, people are more likely to build them into their daily practices. And that's where it will really start to pay dividends for the individual.
I totally agree. So, what was your big takeaway then from last year? And do you feel like you are living the 5 ways? And how can we make sure we can, I don't know, include the habits that we recognize, lead to a positive mental health well-being?
Well, my biggest takeaway from last year was I was enamored at how vulnerable people were when they came in to get filmed for the project.
Yeah.
And that, for me, is something that's really important. Creating an environment with other people that allows us to create sort of trusted relationships. I remember in my undergraduate doing some research on the topic of vulnerability from the sales perspective. And there was a source that I looked at which says allowing ourselves to be seen as imperfect allows us to be trusted. And
Mm.
the reason I say I was quite enamored by that in the 5 salespeople, it just created a very transparent environment where people were comfortable to talk about perhaps some of the challenges that they face in their life. And that perhaps contrasts to the typical image you might have of a salesperson. Particularly if we look at Carl Day, who we're going to talk about later in the podcast, because there's an article we want to reflect on. He's a sales leader, very senior in the tech industry, yet he was able to come and talk from, as you'll see if you watch the Connect video, for example, if you watch that video back, he was showing a level of vulnerability. But what that does is, in his company, for example, in Apogee, that means there's not so much fear around talking about mental health. If you can see people like leaders talking openly, then you don't have the fear or perhaps the anxiety that you might want to open up about some of the struggles you're having.
Yeah. I think it just makes you realize that everyone is human at the end of the day.
Mm,
And actually, we all operate in a very professional capacity, but sometimes you forget actually you're human after all, and kind of speaking openly about mental health is one of those things that can really help create that sense of trust and connection with someone else.
mm,
You mentioned anxiety, and this kind of leads me on to kind of what the focus is on this next week. So, the Mental Health Awareness Week is highlighting anxiety. And what we want to do is discuss in this podcast around anxiety in sales. And I thought I would just start by kind of commenting on how the Mental Health Foundation defines what anxiety is, and I think as sales professionals, we can we can quite often relate to it. So anxiety can affect us physically and mentally, and if you are feeling anxious, you might notice things like your heart rate increasing, headaches, loss of appetite, breathlessness, or chest pain. Anxiety might make you feel really tense or nervous in a situation. You potentially might find it hard to relax. You might feel tearful or have problems sleeping and concentrating. And friends and colleagues might notice that if you are irritable, lack of patience, or just more withdrawn. And as I was reading, how they define it, there's certainly parts of it that I can really relate to. I'm sure we all can working in sales. So yeah, Luke, I kind of guess over to you. How do you think anxiety manifests in your role?
One of the most obvious forms of anxiety that I experience, for example, is overthinking and overanalyzing any sales email that I send. So if you think of anxiety as sort of fear or worry, it's a negative state of mind that suggests you're experiencing poor mental well-being. And for me, that's one that I get concerned at all the time. So why might I have fear or worry about a way I've approached someone? Well, it's quite hard to explain, right? Because I believe anxiety is irrational. A lot of the time, if you go to, for example, overanalyze a sales email that you've sent, there is no reason why you should be of fear or worry. My job is business development, and I am emailing a prospect to see if they would like to buy, let's just say.
Mm,
That's my job. I do it all the time. I've been doing it for around 5 or 6 years. And when I send an email, for example, I'm always going to try my best to do it professionally, to send emails to people that they might actually want to receive, and hopefully get a positive response. But
yeah.
where I experience anxiety, I start to think, oh, do they think I'm not a very good salesperson? Did I use language that was too colloquial for that individual? Was I too audacious? If we link it back to the sales mindsets that we talk about on the podcast so much, we recognize how important it is for salespeople to be bold and daring,
Mm,
but to do it in a tactful way. For me, that can sometimes be a source of anxiety. If I'm trying to catch the attention of the buyer, and I feel that perhaps I've been a little bit too audacious, I can find myself spending time and energy thinking about things and running scenarios through in my mind. You start to come up with a million scenarios and make erratic conclusions about perhaps what that person thinks about you, what that person might think about the company you work for. Um, and so I think what I've explained there is I've kind of referred to the spiraling nature of anxiety, how
yeah.
one small action as a salesperson, as simple as one sales email, can lead very quickly to um, this sort of sporadic thinking about things that are really out of your control.
It's really interesting, and I was doing a bit of research before we started recording this session, and I always thought, obviously, sales is a very stressful um, kind of environment to operate in, and there is so much pressure that I think as salespeople we live, not just in terms of closing a deal or generating revenue or keeping customers, but I was shocked by, for example, the American Institute of Stress, which I'd never come across before, um, have sales professions as the second highest job related stress industry, as it were, only to healthcare professionals. And I just that and I think that's it's really important to have this discussion around anxiety in sales, as I'm quite sure so many people can relate to it.
Sales is, in my experience, can be quite a lonely place. and that can be created by various things. For example, the competitive nature of sales. So you can create a environment of loneliness almost in your own head. It's your own making, that you perhaps feel that you're competing with colleagues for deals or to be the top performer in your sales force. And there's a lot of pressure in sales that comes from uh, being responsible for hitting a target. And what I would liken that to is I believe the job of a salesperson in a lot of cases can actually be written down in one sentence. You can usually nullify the sales job to you are responsible for hitting a target.
Yeah,
Um, and I think there's a lot of organisations out there, and you could even say our own organisation, that is the first and foremost objective. And if you were to hit that, then you could say you've had a good year. If you look at other jobs, let's say operations, logistics, marketing, there are many objectives for the person to hit. They might have different tasks and responsibilities, different projects going on throughout the year. But if you look at a salesperson, typically they're going to have the number to hit, and I think that can create a lot of pressure for that individual. They feel that the sort of the be all and end all is to hit their target, and if they don't do that, then what are the ramifications going to be?
yeah. It's a tricky one to manage. Do you think there's a obvious solution out there that can kind of mitigate against that kind of stressful dynamic that salespeople live?
Well, it's a good question. Ultimately, you said in your research you found sales was the second most stressful occupation.
Yeah,
Um, do I think that would be changed? Perhaps not. Sales is a really well paid profession generally. Um, I like to think in careers and in what salaries you might earn in different occupations. That there's an opportunity cost involved, right? Let's say you go into the medical profession. You study at university for 6 years. You work an incredible number of hours. You deal with a lot of stress. But hey, if you become a brain surgeon, you're probably going to be earning between 6 and 7 figures a year.
mm,
So that's your reward for it. Similarly, in sales, I feel that that's part of the job is to take the stress out of the organisation. Um, you have to go out there and find new business. You have to generate income from existing customers. Um, you have to be your client facing a lot of the time. So if there's ever any issue, you're the person it's directed at. Now we want to talk the positives. You said how can you take that out? Well, for me, it comes down to leadership first and
yeah.
foremost.
I mean, and I agree, and I think it was the article in Business Leader that talks about how important leadership is in order to cultivate a safe space for people to um, operate in sales in a healthy way. Um, I think there was a survey done where something like a quarter of salespeople were were diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder in the last 12 months, which is incredibly high. And I wonder if that is, the backdrop of the world in which we're also operating in, all the uncertainty, the cost of living, the interest rates, all these things are making it harder to operate as a sales professional. But I was just so surprised by how many salespeople were diagnosed with anxiety. But what was interesting is leadership, as you mentioned, is really key in order to create that safe space. Um, and compassion from management is. really important and can significantly positively impact the mental health of salespeople. And if if you are listening to this and are questioning what we're saying, I mean, this is a um, stark reminder, in this survey that 73% of salespeople are considering leaving their current job due to problems with their mental health. And as we know, there is a current problem with um, retainment issues in sales. And so, yeah, it just highlights uh, this importance of just being aware of mental health, aware that sales jobs are really highly stressful, and um, and so cultivating safe spaces for people to operate is crucial.
And that's why I think it's down to the leadership to create that culture.
So, Luke, how can leadership help create that culture?
Well, well, I'm not a leader, but I think we should take a look at one of our one of the leaders in our network, because I think it's a fantastic case study in brilliant leadership, in regards to looking out for people's mental health. Um, and it actually comes from Carl Day at Apogee.
Hmm.
And I mentioned earlier how enamored I was at the vulnerability people showed in that project last year.
Yeah.
Um, and I should actually take it a step back, because when I first came up with the idea of doing the project, Carl was the first person I emailed about it. And, I just talked to Anne as well about how I get anxious about sending emails to people, right? So I send an email to Carl saying, hey, we're really not sure what it's going to look like yet, but I kind of want to get 5 salespeople to be filmed talking about mental health. And he replied probably in about 10 minutes, which was, I mean, I was so grateful for that, because it really put a impetus into the project. I felt that there was immediate buy-in from Carl.
Yeah.
And and his attitude is the same as the attitude you and I have about doing this podcast today. If one person has a listen and feels a bit better about themselves afterwards, then we've done a good job. And Carl had that. That was Carl's ethos for last year's project. He was more than happy to give up half of his day to come and sit on a sofa for half an hour and ask a couple of questions, on the off chance that someone might watch it and benefit from it. Yeah, I had a lot of respect to Carl for that. And it came as no surprise to me, when I came across this article, to find that he's featuring in articles talking about mental health culture in his sales team.
Yeah. So what does he say in the article, Luke?
Well, I think that the first thing it talks about is how Carl wanted to change the culture at Apogee in terms of taking pressure off the salespeople. Um, and he talks about this in terms of sales pressure. He says such pressure is rarely effective, he says, but it does generate significant levels of stress, particularly if the goals are unrealistic. No matter how successful a salesperson is, they always fear they'll be out of a job if they don't hit their targets.
Yeah.
If the company doesn't create the right opportunities, offer the right support, or change the inputs, it can create a lot of anxiety because things are simply out of your control. And I just thought that what's impressive about Carl's approach there is he's looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know what it's like to be a sales leader, but I imagine Carl is under pressure himself to ensure that the sales force at Apogee are performing successfully, hitting their targets. So for Carl to recognise that stress is going to have an adverse effect on financial performance is very very forward thinking, and that's demonstrated by the fact that he realizes that you need to look at alternative ways to improve a sales force rather than just the old school put pressure on them.
Yeah, it's a very short-term approach, I think, for a manager to put short-term, pressure on their salespeople to get results isn't going to get the results over a long term. It may increase high turnover rate of your employees and and so on. But I mean, it's amazing that Carl recognizes that he needs to engage with his team in a way that isn't just putting undue stress and pressure on their teams, and um, yeah, creating that space. And I think he talks a lot about training and development, and he talks a lot about um, coaching as a method to unlock the potential of his team. And I know that Apogee, um, and they've done work with a ex-Royal Marine, haven't they?
Yeah, they've done work with Baz Gray on building resilience in their sales
Yeah,
team. So yeah, I just like the abstract way that Cole looks at the problem, looking at alternative ways to build the salespeople up so that they are more likely to achieve the targets in the long run. Because he puts it here, he uses the phrase that with pressure, people simply run out of ideas and become stale. Their focus tends to narrow when they are put under too much pressure. So I think his approach to mental health is to create this environment of openness, um, create trust, allow people to develop, talk about their strengths and weaknesses openly, and then he'll address those through training and development. And suddenly he's got a more effective sales force.
yeah. It's also backed up by the Journal of Business and Psychology, where they found that salespeople with high levels of anxiety had lower sales revenue and fewer sales than those with lower levels of anxiety. And so, creating the right culture within your sales team, um, building that positive culture is, is the way forward. That is how you will ultimately achieve success over the long term.
And it's worth mentioning, though, he does say it takes time and requires a lot of resilience. So I
Yeah.
mean, that's perhaps a point to it that if you want to manage salespeople just purely with pressure, to me that's a lazy tactic. Um, that's relied upon by perhaps managers who aren't genuine leaders. They're
Mm.
only the only thing in their armory is to scream and shout at their salespeople and expect results through fear. But clearly, that's not going to work in the long term. And like you said, 73% of salespeople considered leaving their job due to problems with their mental health.
Of course, that has, yeah, implications on not just on staff and the morale and within your organization, but filters across everything. If you're feeling anxious, then that the perception with your colleagues can be quite negative as well, and then that can filter through to the customer perception too. And there are studies that highlight, customers are pretty perceptive when dealing with salespeople. So I think we've talked about, what anxiety is. Um, the fact it really is very prevalent in sales as a whole. Now I kind of want to talk about, well, how as salespeople can we manage anxiety? I know it's really important from a leadership point of view, and we've discussed that the environment, the culture has to be right, and um, but for individuals working in sales, what can we do? What are we in control of that can help manage um, those occasions where you might be feeling anxious? And do you have any experience, Luke, on this that you'd want to share with us?
Yeah, of course. So, shortly after my diagnosis with bipolar, I went through cognitive behavioral therapy, and a number of other, therapeutical interventions. And the one thing I learned is the importance of communication. And I'll hone in on this because, on one hand, we have talked about the importance of positive leadership, but it's very important for the individual to communicate how they're feeling, um, as best as they can. I'll give some examples of that. Um, if you're experiencing anxiety, let's say on a daily basis, when have you communicated that to your manager? Have you taken the opportunity to share that with them? As you know, Will, you're my line manager. I'm sure you could testify to the fact that I'm quite transparent about my mental health, and also being quite comfortable to raise the alarm if there's ever any need for it. Give a good example. I was going through a tough time a couple of months ago, experiencing, well, I'd say moderate depression, and I was finding it quite hard to function at work, and I was a bit concerned about some face-to-face interactions that I had coming up. So I had some customer visits booked, and I wasn't sure how they were going to go. So I remember sort of calling you up saying, I'm struggling to even wake up in the morning. I've got a real lack of interest in work at the moment. What can we do about it? The result of that conversation was that you said, you happy to visit that client on the next Tuesday? And I said, well, yeah, it would do me good. It would do me good to get out of the house, get on the road in the car, go and see that customer. But you were able to, well, you basically told me not to do much work for 2 days, is what you did. And that for me was only possible by me talking about how I was feeling.
Yeah.
So, yeah, of course, I commend your management, by the way. That was a good, yeah, great. That was a great move.
Thanks, mate.
But, but, and the but isn't a but against you. The but is you or any manager would not have been able to make that intervention if your reportee, aka me, hadn't said how they were feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not you're not a mind reader, right? So this is why I think there's a lot of onus on the individual being transparent about how they're feeling, because otherwise you don't give your line manager or your organisation the opportunity to put things in place to help you.
Yeah, it's a good point because I guess in this dynamic that we're talking about, um, it's not like Consalia doesn't have we're not a massive company, but you report into me, and to I wouldn't describe myself as a leader, as it were, but I certainly understand the importance of um, getting to know really closely the people that I'm working with, regardless of whether or not someone's reporting into you or not,
Mm,
um, and really understanding the current sort of mindset that someone is in. And then, in my role as a manager, I'm acutely aware of how can I, you know, what's in my toolbox, as it were, to understand and empathize with where you are with your mindsets, and then align that with sort of the goals and objectives of what we need to do. And so when and there's no way I could do that if you weren't approaching me, because otherwise I would always think that you're running at 100% capacity. And it's just not realistic to think that someone can be running at 100% capacity all the time. And I remember that quite well, Luke, because this was just off the back of what was a really intense period where we were having to close quite a few opportunities. And in those periods, I know that it's really full on. And, there is no let up, and it can be pretty relentless. And you can have knockbacks from customers who they say all the right things, and then right at the last minute, they sort of change their mind. I mean, we've all experienced it, and it's the highs and lows of sales.
Yeah, I was going to point out actually that it's even harder to manage in the hybrid world.
Mm.
You know, I personally come into the office once a week. You know, if my legs were chopped off on Wednesday, you wouldn't know till the next Tuesday because you only see me on the screen. You only see my face and my shoulders. You know, so if you imagine that, I'd probably tell you that my legs were chopped off.
Yeah,
I'd probably be in hospital. But the point is, that we take that as just an analogy that there's a lot of things you can't even see physically in when we're working online or remote. So just how hard is it? Just how challenging is it to see what's going on in the mind of someone else?
yeah.
Well, it's nigh on impossible.
And yeah, you're right. It's so difficult to do, especially if you're not seeing someone face to face,
Mm,
because you're relying then on being proactive. And it could be me, you know, checking in and saying, "Look, are you okay? How are you finding, life at the moment and your job, and what stresses are you under?" But it also helps if you're open and having these frank discussions, because you're absolutely right. In a hybrid world, um, it's much harder to observe. You know, I think you can see if someone is feeling demotivated in the office. You can pick up on it.
you can.
But, you can almost hide behind a screen, can't you, when you just have to be on point for the half an hour to an hour that you're on the screen, but for the rest of the time, there could be things going on that you're not aware of.
That's right. I speak from personal experience. When I say it's easy to put on a show. You know,
Yeah.
I can show people that my life is perfect, and everything's fine. When inside, it's not. Because I've got a lot. I've got manic depression, so I know how to. I know the condition well enough that I know how to mask it to the outside world. Um,
Mm.
and it's just one of the things that makes dealing with depression and anxiety, as anxiety being the theme of this year's Mental Health Awareness Week, makes it so hard to deal with because it's hidden and the individual can hide it from other people.
Yeah.
And that's why there's, unfortunately, no simple solution to the problem. But albeit, we're not health experts, but we're throwing out there the 5 ways to well-being. Go and have a look at Cold Day's leadership. So there's a few things out there that people can look to and follow. Um, and then,
Yeah.
most importantly, this honest and transparency that we're on about.
But as you were saying that, I was thinking the same. Well, it goes back to the 5 ways. It is, making sure you are connecting to people, making sure you're taking notice, um, giving, and I always think in my world, time is always the thing that you're short of. Give time, create that time for other people. If I relate it back to anxiety and go back to how we defined anxiety and what were the symptoms of it. One of them is, one of them, correct me if I'm wrong, like when you're withdrawn. And so if you notice someone hasn't really been communicating with you for a while, one day you wake up and you think, oh, I haven't spoken to this person. How are they doing? You know,
Mm.
pick up the phone, find out, and connect and take notice. Give them time. I'm sure it'll be okay, but is is just by the act of doing that kind of thing, I think we can raise the profile of the importance of mental health. You don't need to speak every time, "Oh, how's your mental health?" But just by the action of taking notice and so on, um, you're creating that environment that is going to reduce the stress and the anxiety that I think people are living with.
And for me, you talk about the taking notice part. What do I do to try and relieve anxiety? You know,
Mm,
for me, if we see anxiety as fear or worry, we can attribute anxiety to the past or the future. Seldom are we in a position where we are anxious about the present. Now, that does happen. Say, for example, we're doing a sales pitch or you're going on a first date or whatever. You are in the present and you are anxious about that scenario. But for me, I begin each day with morning reflections. What have I got for the day ahead? Um, and then in the evening, when I take stock before I go to sleep, try and end with a period of meditation every day. And what I try and do is encapsulate all the fear and worry into that day. So
mm,
I'm always going to be possibly anxious about something that's coming ahead in my morning routine. But at the end of the day, I try and say goodbye to that day. Leave those things there. It doesn't always work. I'm not a monk, but but by doing that, I try and recognise that there's always going to be fears or worries in our life,
yeah,
and they are going to sometimes govern our behaviour and our actions. But as best as possible, try and live in the present. That's why earlier we went for a walk in Bushy Park with a coffee. I didn't have much fear or worry the whole time. I don't think I did have any fear or worry because we relate it back to the five ways. You and I were connected.
yeah,
Give, it was my round. Um, take notice. For me, I love walking. I'm off on a hiking holiday next week. For me, that's when I really take notice of my surroundings, being in nature, whether it's a mountain or a park or walking alongside a river. Learn, in an abstract way. I relate the learning part when you're spending time with someone else to learn what's going on in their life. It's not always picking up a book or doing a degree, as much as I'd like to say that, just for a sales perspective.
mm,
But sometimes it's like, what can I actually learn about someone else? Do I know what they're going through right now?
yeah,
And then being active does what it says on the tin. And there's no surprise that, like I said, I had no fear or worry for that hour. I wasn't thinking about anything else.
yeah, yeah. For me, it's always, in the sales context, it's when you have a big meeting or a big pitch, and it's the moment where you walk in through the room and you're meeting everyone. Quite often, there's new faces in there, and very quickly, uh, you want to make a positive impression, right? We're in
Mm.
sales, so we want to make that positive impression. And it's that those kind of thoughts, that internal monologue that you have, um, can be a bit distracting sometimes.
It's tough getting up in front of people.
Mm,
I that's I have to say, one of my primary sources of anxiety as a salesperson.
yeah,
I'm incredibly confident one to one. Love talking with people, But you put me up in front of a group of people, and my heart rate goes up, my mouth gets dry, and I suddenly think loads of people are looking at me.
Yeah,
And it's tough. I had it. We were delivering to a client a workshop, and Steve invited me to get involved at one point. He's just trying to sort of coach me into trying new things, and I absolutely folded in front of everyone. I was like this, I couldn't even get words out, and I was like, I wanted to be, I wanted to fall through the floor, um, but you know, sometimes conquering those fears can help. Maybe in time, maybe I'll learn to deal with that. I
yeah,
probably need to. For me, I need to be looking at what is the fear there. You could talk about fear in general, but what exactly is the fear? And it was funny. One of our
mm,
colleagues, Hillary, was straight into coaching mode, and she was asking me exactly that sort of question.
yeah.
5 minutes later, she's like, "Well, what are you scared of?" I was like, "Oh, I don't know. I'm not entirely sure what I was scared of in that scenario. It's just an irrational thought that I can't do public speaking."
The and so one of the aha moments that kind of resonates with me, and it kind of relates to about what you've just said, but we we're very keen on the growth mindset, Carol Dweck's growth mindset. And for me personally, that was such an aha moment where you view um, you either have a fixed or a growth mindset, and the fixed is like what you've just described. I can't do public speaking,
Mm,
or you view it through a growth mindset, and you think every opportunity is a learning opportunity. So failure is okay because you're going to learn from it, or you put yourself in positions that are sort of outside of your comfort zone, and of course you might feel uncomfortable, vulnerable, stressed, anxious. But also, it's in those opportunities that I think you can grow and you can learn a lot and you can develop. So I think there are situations where it's normal to have these kind of senses, these emotions where you feel anxious, and it's not something um, necessarily you need to be avoiding. It's having that growth mindset of saying, okay, accepting things not every time go your way, learning from it, and then reflecting on it. You've mentioned reflection that you do every morning, and um, I agree. I think you can reflect on, in, and for action, and these are really good skills that can stand you in good stead to process things that um, that are outside of the norm.
yeah, I like that point. And relating back to the example, failure would have been saying, "No, I will not stand up and talk
Yeah,
because
yeah,
I'm not going to get the opportunity to learn what I did well, what I could do better, and what I wouldn't do again."
yeah.
Um, and it sort of opens me up to the counter argument to what we've talked about in terms of pressure.
Mm,
I saw the phrase, pressure makes diamonds, as it does, extreme pressure. And in my life, there have been times where pressure has been incredibly healthy. One of the things I struggle with is waking up in the morning. I sometimes have a lack of motivation, and it's also caused by the medication I take. Having sometimes the pressure of a sales job has been absolutely brilliant to me, um, from a sort of getting me out of bed in the morning, but giving me a real sort of a force, a sort of a motivation, a purpose.
Mm.
I like the fact that my sales job can be whittled down to one sentence. I talked about that earlier about how that might lend itself to pressure. If you could say that ultimately your job is to, you know, I won't say how many students, but let's say my job is to get 60 students to start a year. Let's just say off the top of the head. I like that simplicity. That gives me a lot of drive, gives me a lot of focus because I can come into work or I can start work each day and I can start chipping away at that goal. In the past, I had a job as a junior consultant, and I was never really sure what I was doing each day. I was sort of going to team meetings, and I'd be told, "Oh, oh, you're doing this. You're going to help make that PowerPoint presentation, or you're going to do that research. Um, you're going to do this Excel spreadsheet," and you felt like you were sort of very much like told what to do each day. Whereas
Mm.
sales for me, it gives a huge amount of purpose and also independence.
Yeah.
Um, and I would credit a lot of my sort of development as an individual to having worked in sales. And,
Yeah.
you know, we've also talked about how there's a higher rate of depression in salespeople, which is really important to acknowledge. And that suggests that more could be done to support salespeople. But I'm the opposite. I was diagnosed with manic depression, then decided to become a salesperson, right? So, I contribute to that statistic, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the other way around. And I have to say, although there can be pressure of having a target, in my mind, I love the clarity of sales. You have a very simple job, you know, particularly in business development as a specific, that's what I do. Yeah, it's very clear. And I
Mm.
think a lot of anxiety we've talked about can come from miscommunication and people not being clear with each other. You know, my job's very clear at Consalia. Get people to do an apprenticeship. You know, you could look at it in as abstract way you like. You could write a really long job description if you want. I probably won't read it, by the way. Um, but but the point is, most salespeople can whittle their job down to one sentence,
Mm.
and that clarity is really quite healthy in some ways.
Yeah. And so I just wanted to sort of I've got lots of things going on in my mind at the moment, and I'm just wondering, as Consalia is a sales business school. We understand that um, anxiety manifests itself as a uh, as something within the sales industry, and I think the research has shown that it is really prevalent and it's something that needs to be spoken about. And
Mhm.
that's what we're doing today. But I also want to kind of think about, you know, how can we support everyone who's working as a sales profession, uh, who is a sales professional even, and understand that we can support each other, and it brings me back to a sense of community and how sales professionals need to be part of a community, and this is something that I really want to address, and this is something that I think Consalia can really help bring sales professionals together in a place that is outside of their work environments to support one another, going through all of the challenges that they go through from a sales point of view. Whether that is with mental health or whether that is challenges that they need to overcome with customers and things like that. I think as a industry, we should form a community.
Yeah, very challenging to do. Uh,
Yeah, I don't think we can
but,
do it overnight, but if we
well,
as you said right at the beginning, if we can help one person.
Yeah. I would say actually easy to do, very challenging to do effectively. You know,
Mm,
you don't want it just to be, some virtue signaling LinkedIn page that 1,000 people join, and you then turn around and say we're helping people because we've got 1,000
no,
people.
no.
But you've done your you did your master's research on communities.
Mm.
Um, Communities are so impactful, particularly if
When
things
they
are
work
working.
well, like you said,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
it requires participation and a willingness to share and to share knowledge and insight um, and from what we're discussing, it needs to be personal as well.
yeah. And
And that's not something easy to do, but, even on the subject of mental health, I still don't think people talk about it enough. And would they would people be open in talking about it you know, to a wider audience in a community?
well, I've got a community of 2 people, so I don't think that's large enough to call a community. But he and I meet once a week, pretty much
Yeah,
once a week, and it's kind of exactly as you were describing in terms of what community for mental health people could be. We both bring to the table different things each week, but ultimately we pull each other up.
yeah.
We really do support each other, and it's got me thinking. Your question about what we could do, and then I'm like, well, how could we extrapolate what me and this guy do each week? But then you also said, would people be open to talking like that in a large community? Um, I would go back to the stuff that me and my friend talk about on our weekly chats wouldn't be talked about in the community.
Yeah,
Not from a not safe for work perspective. I mean, sometimes it is probably that sort of content, and we talk about all sorts of things. But most importantly, it's because we both trust each other, um, so we can come to each other with whatever's going on in our heads, and
mm,
it won't go any further than that. That well, it's not even a circle; it's 2 people.
yeah.
um, but it's certainly, I'm really glad you brought that up, um, because I think Consalia are looking to do more with bring out is it the sales transformation community?
Yes, I believe so. I mean, there's more to come on that. Um, but yeah, we want to connect and support and elevate the the profession. And I think the reason why I brought it up in this podcast is because, as you said, is it's around connecting people. And one thing you also said earlier was, sometimes it can be quite a lonely place operating in sales.
Mm,
And I'm fairly sure that the problems each of us as individuals are going through are shared with other people.
definitely.
And I think that sharing is what a community is about, but it's also what is valuable. And it can be so valuable for the sales profession as a way to support and elevate and to connect with each other and learn from each other and things like that.
Mm,
Yeah, more to come on that. Undefined, but I think it's a really good idea. Yeah.
beautiful. Look forward to hearing.
Well, Luke, thank you so much for your time and talking about mental health from your experience. Um, I, for one, find it really interesting, fascinating, and I know there's more that we can do. But I think you know discussing mental health on a platform like a podcast is so important, and hopefully it leads to more and more sales people discussing mental health openly, um, getting the help that they need and deserve, and ensuring that they're working in a really positive way that isn't leading to anxiety in sales. So thank you very much.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me on. And I'll finish with this. If there's anyone listening or watching the videos on LinkedIn, if you fancy having a chat about mental health, just give us a shout. Um, you know, always up for having a conversation with someone who wants to halve a problem. Problem shared is a problem halved, or even if you want to talk
Yeah.
about anything. So yeah, offers there.
Yes, and don't listen to me. And Luke will be very discreet, and it won't be recorded.
Yeah, we'll be yeah.
Shared on as a podcast. But yeah, great. Thank you, Luke.
Cheers, Will. We enjoyed making this.